welcome to today's episode. We're going to talk a little bit about introduction to motor controls. So aside from the actual physical ability to show you the circuit itself here, we're going to go ahead and just kind of talk a little bit about symbols, and then we'll spend a lot more time talking about designing the schematics, what the schematics mean, how it's going to work through the circuit, etc. But before we even get started, we need to kind of have like a base knowledge of some of the symbols that we're going to deal with in our role working with basic motor controls. And so I'm going to start us off with talking a little bit about types of push buttons. So for the most part, we're going to have just a simple push button, and then you can have toggle switches, and you can have mushroom-headed push buttons. And for all the intents and purposes, we're just going to use PB as a push button symbol. And then there are other types of buttons out there, such as like a wobble switch, which kind of like a little joystick that you might move back and forth kind of thing. And then we'll come talk about selector switches at another time. But I will go ahead and at least give us the kind of a rough idea of that. Additionally, with that, I want to talk a little bit about the contacts that these will all use. And we'll go through some of that information. And then we'll talk about the outputs and just the very basic outputs of those that come with that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started on that. So a simple push button is just going to be a button that we're going to press. And when we press it, it's either going to change state to a normally closed or a normally open status of whatever it might be. So for all intents and purposes in most things, we would draw that as a normally open contact, and we would label that N period O period. And so that's a normally open contact. We would also have a normally closed contact where we would go ahead and draw it like this, and we put an N period, C period for normally closed contact. And what that basically means is when the button is not being pressed, it is traditionally in that position or that state. If we had, for instance, a toggle switch, we could toggle between this position or this position. Whereas a push button is going to allow us to switch between this position or this position. Whichever one is the position it's normally going to be in, it's going to be in the opposite position when we use a push button. When we toggle it, obviously it's going to stay in those positions. If we have a mushroom-headed push button, it's going to use the same features here as well. The only difference is how it's drawn to represent it in our drawing, or the type of button it's going to be in a physical state. Selector switch oftentimes works very similar to a toggle switch, and then a joystick switch can and cannot, just depends on how it is, but traditionally a joy switch is going to work on as a push button type. So for the understanding of how that would work in maybe like a certain type of diagram, you might see like a normally open contact written something like that, whereas a normally closed contact might be written something kind of like that, or they may write it the opposite direction where it might be on top. Kind of depends on who's writing it sometimes, but traditionally this is the way it would be written. This is the correct way. I will tell you that in some instances I will write it like this because it's more simplistic for me in my head to think through that it's going to be up in that state, and when I press it, it's going to drop out. You can have systems where these are all going to be what's known as a single pole and single throw. So you may end up with something that looks more like this, and then a lot of times we'll put dashes on it, and the dashes represent that these two are connected. So this would be a single break, but it's a double pole single throw. And what that simply means is that it's two different separate poles, but it's on a single throw. Meaning that if it's on a push button, up here, then it's simply when we press that button, it's going to go ahead and throw both of these contacts at the same time. Now, back to our buttons again here. Okay, we've talked a little bit about the contacts here, and then vice versa, by the way, on these contacts. But back to our buttons here. How do we draw the button so that we know that's the type of button we're using in our more elaborate schematic? And the way we would do that is we would take our push button, and for a normally open contact push button, we would draw it simply like this. And you can label it, you can not label it, it's all entirely up to you how you would do that. If you wanted to normally close contact, once again, so this is where I kind of come into that point where I go back to, though you could draw it like this, and this is the correct way to do it, I will traditionally do it this way because my brain thinks a lot of times into the push button contact. If you were drawing these in a mushroom head, you would simply just put the mushroom head on top. So you have a normally open push button and it's a mushroom head. And then vice versa, you draw it the same, or excuse me, oops, just redraw it. So you'd have your mushroom head, and then you have a normally closed push button. And that's your mushroom head there as well. If you had a type of illuminated push button, which do exist, you would draw those so that you would have, like in a normally open contact, or excuse me, a normally closed contact, you would have it written in such a way that it'd be like this, and then you would put a little pilot light on top, and then you might go ahead and do that, and then whatever color your pilot light's going to be, you would use that as a symbol. So like if it's a red pilot light, you'd do that. So this here is going to be an illuminated push button. Alright, moving on, we're going to talk about our outputs. Which, by the way, if you have any questions or comments that you want to bring up to this and you want to know more information about, please feel free to comment to this video and I will gladly answer those comments. On our outputs, traditionally we'll have a type of coil. You might label this, for instance, if it's a motor starter, you might label it M1 as a motor starter for motor starter 1. So you'd have MTR1, and then that's going to be M1. If you had a solenoid valve going out to like a particular solenoid, I'm trying to think like a pneumatic solenoid or maybe a hydraulic solenoid, you would draw it out as a solenoid valve. And actually it looks a little more like this. My bend got a little off here, so it looks a little more like that to correct that. If you have, for instance, like a pilot light or maybe a test light or something like that, you would draw that out as a light like this. And then you would label it whatever that light would be, whether it be green, red, blue, white, something like that, you would label it such as. If you have like a specified like push to test type of light, you might have like multiple contacts here, and then you'll have like your throw on a particular piece here that goes to your light, and then it's going to go out to whatever it's going to go to. And again, that's going to be whatever test light you're wanting to use there. A lot of times those are kind of all that we're going to really focus on using here. Particularly this one here is going to be our best used piece here as a coil. We'll use the same piece for any type of relay. So if we're using like a relay, we might do the same thing and put CR1 or CR2 inside of there, and that just simplifies that this is a coil of some sort. So a lot of times CR is going to be your control relay. Traditionally in like older circuits and stuff, that the CR1 is usually your first control relay, and those are usually going to be your safety contacts. So that concludes everything I have for this video, so please stay tuned for additional information. Thank you.